Hi guys, this is a basic review to cover some of the concepts that I want you to understand that also have a lot of jargon. And so I'm trying to get you past the jargon because I would rather you understand the concept than, discipline-specific language that you may or may not ever use again. First one we're going to cover is allocentric perspective and how it relates to a number of different aspects of cognition in human prehistory. First one we'll cover is what we call wayfinding. And there are two different main types of wayfinding. And wayfinding is a term used in anthropology to describe different navigation techniques. But two different main types of wayfinding we talk about in prehistory. The first one is route following. It's basically, you know how to get somewhere, but not because you know where you sit in relationship to north, south, or the sun, the stars. You know how to get somewhere because you know how to follow landmarks, waypoints. So you have this ability to, say, memorize different landmarks and when and where or what direction you should turn at those landmarks. So I will tell you, I'm giving you directions to my farm or something, and I'll say, well, go down that road, and when you see a stop sign, take a right. Follow the road until you see the first gas station and go right there. And then you're going to go over a bridge, and you'll keep going until you see a big oak tree. And you'll turn left, something like that. And that is a fairly simple way of navigating, but it's probably how people first learned, following terrain features like bottoms of cliffs that might have a lot of organic, nutrient-rich soil. So you've got a lot of berries and things, somewhat protected by the cliff, a lot of moisture. And then that terrain ends and you've got open space until the next set of cliffs or terrain features. And gradually through foraging, expanding out from your circle of the forest or jungle you live in, you're going to learn this basic approach to navigation. The next one's more complicated, and that is what's called survey knowledge. This one matters because it requires allocentric perspective. Big word. What it means is that you can think about where you sit in three-dimensional space, relative to, let's say, the next major nearest landmark. And this is where I talked earlier about having that sort of homing beacon in your head, where you're kind of always readjusting where you think you're at based off that. And that's where you're using simple technologies, a perspective that allows you to envision things you can't see. So you can put yourself mentally past the mountain because you understand that, there's going to be a creek there or something that you're going to follow. And so you kind of like mentally traveling in the air, or traveling, you could say 4 dimensions in a sense, because when we get into hand axe manufacture, allocentric perspective enables us to envision what we're not seeing now, what this tool is going to look like after you take some flakes off. And going back to the navigation component, that homing beacon I was referring to, that mental homing beacon, is something called space constancy. It's sort of knowing where things are relative to each other. And this is where the Micronesian navigators are particularly good at, because they've been doing it so long, sailing these little boats, the massive ocean, in the dark, going from one small island to the next, hundreds of miles away. They are constantly adjusting and readjusting their mental understanding of where they are in relationship to the island they just left, the island they're going to. They're using the stars. They're using these simple rope web maps that have basically look like a spider web, and the nodes where the ropes come together indicate islands. Sometimes there's shells in those nodes, and they use those as relative mental anchor points to understand where this island sits in relationship to the next one and the next one. And then they're absorbing a number of sensory inputs that they may not even be aware of through their experience, because their working memory is so focused on the task of handling the boat, the wind, tacking in the sail, understanding how close they're getting to shoals, sandbars, things like that, that they're not aware that maybe the lap of the waves coming up against the boat is feeding information into their body. And that's just part of what they call embodied cognition, where you've got this multiple sensory input activity going on, and you're sort of subconsciously processing a lot of it while focusing on the most important aspects of it. And if you're sailing a boat, the immediate most important aspects are keeping that boat afloat, tracking the waves and the wind, etc. So that informs our discussion later on hand axes. So getting into the hand axes, we're going to talk about why you'd need this concept of allocentric perception, knowing where you sit, or being able to envision other perspectives that are not yours, because that's what you have to do with hand axes. To manufacture one, it is like a game of chess, but the outcomes aren't quite as precise and defined as a chess game. So, for example, if you're starting with a raw material, and I want to manufacture something that looks like this, I have to envision what 3 or 4 different percussive blows here are going to do and create over here. So I'm taking a perspective of the future of the stone. Now, when we talk about the earliest hand axes, the ones I previously referred to as ugly, that's more like route following. Something like this piece could have come off something like this, and I could have used a very simple algorithm of strike, flip, strike, flip, strike, flip, and then hit a little bit harder as I get towards where I want my pointy bit to be. And that essentially could have been your route following. But your survey knowledge hand axes, to manufacture something like this, is a lot more difficult. And that's because the good materials to make things like this often have a lot more difficulty involved with them. And a lot of flint, this is English flint, nodules are round or weird shapes. So you don't have a sort of preformed hand axe that just needs a little bit of work to turn it into something that will do work, you know, the tool you want. You get these sort of oval or spherical nodules that have to really, your complexity increases tenfold when you're wanting to make something this refined, this narrow, and this symmetrical on both faces, right? So when we go from ugly hand axes that do actually very effectively hit bone and give access to bone marrow, to these more refined hand axes, which, by the way, are absolutely terrible at extracting bone marrow, because these were made for cutting. And as an example, this is one I did in a test study. This was a very nice hand axe, and I used it to try and extract bone marrow from a large cow femur, and the tip broke off the second time I used it. Whereas this ugly thing took about 2 hits, and I managed to get a femur this long, this thick, cracked open, and I had access to bone marrow. And this ugly thing could be made in 5 to 10 minutes. This took 2 to 3 hours. Well, a couple hours. But the amount of experience required to be able to make this took a lot longer. This took me a couple tons of flint I napped through until I got to the ability to be able to regularly make these with precision. So that's a shift when people are doing that. Here, they're following a simple algorithm, which is like following a route. And here, you have allocentric perspective. They're envisioning different perspectives they can't see. They're envisioning what's going to happen in the future. They're using more complicated materials. And they're getting more refined tools. To carry this 10 miles on a hunt burns a lot less calories than carrying this. One of the things they do in some of the military training you see for the infantry or special forces is they make you carry like an ammunition box, but not 2, just 1 in one hand. It's a heavy box and it's awkward. Okay, it's not so heavy you can't lift it, but you have to move 10 miles carrying this big, heavy, clunky object that is awkward. That's like carrying one of these. It's heavy. You can't run with it. If you do, it's going to be a very efficient running system. Whereas this is something you could almost slip into a pouch, kind of ignore. This is a portable tool. This is an expensive, calorie-wise expensive portable tool. So, going from that, we're going to get into aesthetics, hand axes and aesthetics. This is going to talk about peak shift and overdeterminism. Okay, what is overdeterminism or what is peak shift? Peak shift is making something beyond what's necessary for it to function. Overdeterminism is basically the same thing. We are overdetermining or overmaking something beyond the absolute necessity of function. There are a number of speculations about why people made hand axes beyond the functional. So I'm going to give a few examples because we need to understand what is functional and what isn't. First off, this is a pretty hand axe. It has aesthetic appeal. It's symmetrical. It's got a sort of sultry number of curves on it. But also, if you have to use this to project energy to make it act as a wedge to split other material, the symmetry allows that movement to be done more effectively. If you have one of these that has a large chunk of mass on one end, now you're having to manage your muscles and your hand-eye coordination. One arm's going to be doing more work than the other. It becomes a much more difficult endeavor if you don't have a symmetrical hand axe. So if hand axes, the earlier ones, the ugly ones, or even the pretty ones, were used as kind of bone marrow can openers, then the symmetry makes sense. It enables more efficient use to project force and energy. Because essentially this is a wedge, like a splitting wedge you'd use splitting wood. Some archaeologists have speculated that the shape that we get like this is actually a byproduct of flint knapping in order to drive flakes off, which are where these lines, each of these sets of lines represents where a piece of stone is hit and a flake came off. Better examples on this one, each of these would have produced a flake that was very sharp. So the goal wasn't to make this, it was just the natural byproduct of making flakes. Well, that's probably a speculation by somebody who's never used rough material. They may have learned flint knapping, but they did it with nice flint they bought from a rock shop or something, and they've never worked with rough quartzite. Chert that doesn't always do what you want it to. Even crappy limestone with some sand in it that just has enough silica to be able to create an edge. And ironically, you can actually still see some fat and sinew and from the experiment I did with this tool that would never be flint knapped by a modern flint knapper. Why would you bother with this crappy material? Was far better at extraction of bone marrow than something like this. But because modern flint knappers don't practice with this stuff, they don't understand what was going on. That's the value of experimental archaeology, because what you do not get with these types of rocks, of which many of them are found in the record of archaeology, the flakes you get off this are not sharp. They're not going to be good for cutting meat. They're terrible. So that automatically kind of dismisses that speculation or that hypothesis. But still, that gets us to the point of what is overdeterminism, what is peak shift. Okay, this comes into neuroaesthetics. Neuroaesthetics is the study of aesthetics from a neurological perspective. Sounds complicated, but it's just sort of understanding why we find things to be aesthetically pleasing. Now, we don't use the concept art very often. Art is far too subjective. It's culturally mediated. What I might consider art from my Midwestern American culture is not what somebody from Saudi Arabia might consider art. And even within our own culture in the United States, different people from different backgrounds view art or fine art as from very different perspectives. And that's why the term art isn't really very useful. It does get discussed when we talk about things like the cave paintings of Chauvet and Lascaux, but it's not very useful. So instead, we describe aesthetic. And the aspect of aesthetic that's important is that instead of looking for something we would call art, aesthetic looks for things and asks the questions of why, of things that we find visually appealing or emotionally impactful from maybe a universal perspective. So when we talk about aesthetics, we're talking about something that, well, not something, we're talking about the search for aesthetic appeal. It has a universal nature. Anything that is impactful or creates an emotional state that's intentional, and that sits outside of art, because the term art and craft can be used almost interchangeably in some circumstances. So what are aesthetics? What can we look, what do we think about why we have some universal aesthetic appeals like symmetry? First off, there is not one neural network devoted to aesthetic appreciation. And that's a fairly critical thing to understand, because it means that it's a multi-sensory, multi-mental domain experience, and therefore there's not one part of the brain that says, ah, that's aesthetically appealing, that's what we want. So that gives us an understanding that there's not one single evolutionary reason that we evolved an aesthetic appeal for a specific process. So in the reading of the Wynne and Coolidge paper or book, they reference what they consider to be probably the most relevant breakdown of the domains that contribute to aesthetic appreciation by humans. The first one is sensoromotor, the second is emotion evaluation, and the third is meaning knowledge. So the sensoromotor is sort of, let's think of it as more gut instinct. It's your subconscious sort of first instinct appreciation of what has an aesthetic appeal. The emotion evaluation is sort of, okay, you're looking at something, it may be unfamiliar, but it has an emotional impact, and you're wondering why that is. And that comes from a different region of the brain physically. And then the third one, meaning and knowledge, that is more of a culturally or experience mediated understanding. So I may look at this hand axe, and because I'm a flint knapper, have a great appreciation for it, because not just am I a flint napper, I also know how hard this material is to work, and I know what time period it came from. So somebody who doesn't know anything about flint knapping might view this hand axe as far more appealing. Now, from a just pure visual perspective, I think this one is. This is 800,000 years old. It's got a lot of history. It represents a major shift in human technology and human lifestyle. This one I made, it has personal meaning to me because it was the first one I made that really met the category for like boxgrove hand axes and things like that. So that's the part that's the culturally mediated aspect, or the thing that comes from your appreciation of it because of your knowledge, your culture, or your experience. So then when we go back to something like peak shift, what is peak shift? What is overdetermination? I have a smallish boxgrove style hand axe that I made. It's kind of an ovate. It's pretty thin. Took some time. What is overdetermined in this is the fact that I kept some calcite crystals that had formed in the top. I spent a lot of time napping around these to avoid breaking them off. And because these have a different density, they're going to transmit energy differently through the hand axe, which means I had to transmit energy differently through the hand axe, because every one of these flake scars you see is a fossilized wave of energy. The patterns you see, the waves, that is the actual energy wave, just like radio waves or ripples in a pond. Only in a stone tool, they actually get preserved. So you get to see every strike and blow, every wave of energy pass through it. Now, overdetermination can be a little bit inferred by the fact that we get these fossilized energy waves. Whoever made this stone tool took a lot of time to remove this piece here, and took a lot of time to remove this ridge right there. Did they need to? It still would have been symmetrical. They didn't really remove enough mass to make it much lighter. No, they were trying to make this thinner, more attractive. It wasn't really contributing, since it was both sides, to the functionality. It was a risky endeavor to take these, however, because to get a removal here, you're kind of having to work your way in, and you're striking and directing a lot of energy towards the middle, which might cause your hand axe to have an end fracture. So when I hit something in the middle hard enough, it pops the end off. So all the work that went into this might have been ruined just so they could get these couple little flakes off. That is peak shift. That's overdetermination. That is people starting to show off skill. Why would you do that? We do it today. That's why it's sometimes referred to as the sexy hand axe hypothesis. If you can show off your ability to make that 800,000 years ago, well, you are highly skilled. You have allocentric perception. You can envision different perspectives than your own. There's a lot of things that come with that. You probably make for an appealing mate. So it's like somebody who's been financially successful driving a Ferrari. It's showing off. Academics have their own way of showing off too, I might add. A little bit more subtle and nuanced than a Ferrari usually, but we still do it. Everybody does it. So that is where we're talking about peak shift. Now, when we look at something like this big mamma jamma, all right, they're roughly the same size, found at the same site, same location. This guy has a chisel tip, and we kind of know that these were part of a tool kit. We got the point tip, chisel tip. Chisel tip allows you to split and fracture that bone this way. Not a lot of care was put into this guy to try and make it pretty. It just needed to be functional. It had to have symmetry here that allowed the arms to grasp so you could have equal balance of weight and drive that force straight down. But there's no excess removals here. There's nothing done that contributes to its aesthetic appeal. This is a purely practical hand axe. I wouldn't call it ugly, but there's no peak shift. Considering they're found next to each other, nobody spent the time to make those types of removals to thin out these facets of the hand axe. And you get even more ridiculous versions of this. There's some pictures of them in the text where you have these hand axes that are like this big, too big for a person to do this effectively. And that shows not only that we are thinking from another perspective in how we look at the stone, but we're thinking from another perspective of how people are perceiving us. This is what they call intentionality. Now we're getting into theory of mind, which is how thinking about how others are thinking. And then they get into what's called recursiveness. So I'm thinking about how you're thinking about how I'm thinking. That's 3 orders of intentionality. So now I'm thinking about how you're thinking about this lecture, about how I'm thinking. And then I'm going to go ahead and think through a 4th level. Well, you're thinking about how I'm thinking. And I'm going to try and predict what then you're going to be thinking after I do this action. So that gets us to some interesting components when we start looking at people trying to show off and trying to capture other people's attention. And in the literature, they use the word ego. And they don't mean ego in the sense of, I think very highly of myself. Ego is a sense of you. You have a sense of you're an individual. And then understanding another ego is understanding someone else as an individual and what they might be thinking. This gets us into one of the examples about deception. Deception is important to understand. I'm going to wait for the car to go. The ability to deceive somebody by chimpanzees, for example, is an important one because it means you can think about how another person's thinking and what their perspective might be. Chimpanzees are capable of doing this. They are known to engage in deceptive acts. So one chimpanzee might be, there's a good story about observation, let's call it. There was kind of a beta chimpanzee in a troop, but the female chimpanzees liked him. So he would sneak away behind bushes and act like he was doing a task, you know, gathering nuts or something, and keep his head above the bushes where he could see one of the alpha chimpanzees. So he's pretending to do something he's not. Meanwhile, one of the female chimpanzees had come in behind the bushes with him, and they had copulated. So he'd engaged in a deceptive act to gain an advantage for himself by deceiving an alpha chimpanzee who had considered that female to be his primary mate. Okay, that required 2nd, 3rd level order intentionality. There'll be a question on there, I'll go ahead and say it, about whether dogs are capable of theory of mind. Just put it that way. And all you need to know is that I had a very smart dog and I loved him a lot. And he was a sneaky, clever little bastard. So, other things I think we need to cover. real quick. Okay, you should understand what the three neural networks engaged in aesthetic experience. People who study symbols, signs, icons, indexes, they're called semioticians. The study of these different ways of expressing information is actually fairly important. So understand what a sign, symbol, index is, and symbols, symbols in general. So like an index is something that represents something related to what you're trying to represent. So for example, if I was putting up a sign on a trail and I put image of bare feet, like footprints of a bear. Okay, it's not an image of a bear, but it's indexically related to a bear. You can look at it and say, oh, that's a bear print. So that might tell you, okay, don't go down this trail, or if you do, anticipate bears. Whereas an icon would just be a picture of a bear. It's directly related. I mean, it is directly an image or something that is very obviously what you're trying to represent. And then when we get to symbols, symbols are unrelated to what you're representing. So when I say bear, the word bear in English spelled out has no relationship that you could infer that ties it to this animal unless you speak English. And we have all agreed as English speakers that B-E-A-R means bear. So it's completely unrelated. It is an abstract concept, and abstract concepts are very difficult concepts to comprehend. And that's why people look for these different aspects or use of these different methods of communication in early human history, because it tells us a lot about their ability to communicate and how they're thinking and what complexity they are able to grasp concepts such as abstractism. Okay, you should look up and understand what hormones are related to adrenaline. I mentioned them before in the previous lecture. Have a good idea of that. Understand what Liebenberg described as the ability for the Bushman to focus intently on the primary tasks of tracking an animal while at the same time absorbing extra stimulus, massive amounts of other stimulus that they've learned how to observe and understand through experience and education, but they're learning it or absorbing it subconsciously, because their primary focus is on the track, the spoor, the things that have the most importance at the moment. But still, they're being informed by all these other stimuli coming in, and a lot of them are being processed subconsciously, just like the riverboat captain from the 19th century example, who calls it intuition or gut instinct. Well, instinct and gut instinct, what are these? Probably absorbing a lot of stimulus that you're not consciously aware of because you're hyper-focused, because things like adrenaline are coming into what you're doing, etc., etc. There's other hormones involved too, but just know what the more scientific name is for the adrenaline hormone and hormones. Again, go back and look at why art is a difficult concept to discuss in anthropology and cognitive studies versus aesthetics. Pay attention to the Boxgrove hand axe literature. What is the significance of the find there? And then lastly, take a look at Lascaux and Chauvet. Look at some of the details of how those cave paintings might have been made, what was required to make them. Those paintings are interesting for a number of reasons. So the reference for this section about Lascaux and Chauvet, kind of have an understanding of what all was going on with those paintings. Yes, they're beautiful, but they didn't show up in a vacuum, and they were not made in a day. And that's about all I've got. Good luck with the test, and I will publish what the next assignment is in the next lecture, either Sunday night or Monday.